Jackson Reeves's blood ran cold as he pushed open the barn door of his supposedly abandoned inheritance and found himself surrounded by 100 starving animals, silently pleading for their lives. The widowed cowboy who had numbed himself to all emotion since his wife's death now faced a choice that would either heal his shattered heart or confirm his deepest fear, that he was truly incapable of caring for anything ever again. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, but Jackson Reeves still couldn't believe what it said. His uncle Elijah, a man he'd met exactly twice in his life, had left him a ranch in Montana. The attorney's precise language stated that Jackson had inherited the entirety of the Whispering Pines property, including all structures and contents therein. He'd called the lawyer twice to confirm it wasn't some elaborate scam. Both times the man had patiently explained that yes, the 200-acre property was now his, free and clear. "Probably ain't worth the paper the deed is printed on," Jackson muttered as his truck bounced along the rutted dirt road that supposedly led to his inheritance. The directions had taken him 30 miles from the nearest town, deep into a valley nestled between rolling hills covered in pine and aspen. According to the locals in the diner where he'd stopped for coffee that morning, the place had been abandoned for nearly 2 years after his uncle's passing. Old Elijah was a strange one, the waitress had told him, refilling his cup without being asked. Kept to himself those last few years. Shame about the ranch falling to ruin like that. Jackson didn't respond much to her or the curious glances from the other patrons. He wasn't much for conversation these days, not since Annie. The thought of his wife sent the familiar ache through his chest. 2 years gone, taken by cancer that moved so quickly the doctors barely had time to explain what was happening before she was gone. After the funeral, he'd sold their small Texas ranch, unable to bear the emptiness of rooms that had once echoed with her laughter. He'd been drifting ever since, taking seasonal work on ranches across the Southwest, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. Maybe that was why Uncle Elijah had left him this place. 2 broken, lonely souls. The old man must have recognized something of himself in his rarely seen nephew. The truck crested a small rise, and Jackson's first view of Whispering Pines spread before him. He eased off the gas, taking in the sight. The setting was undeniably beautiful, a natural basin surrounded by pine-covered hills, with a creek cutting through the northern edge of the property. The main house was larger than he'd expected, a 2-story log cabin with a wide front porch. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, a weathered barn, a bunkhouse, what looked like a workshop, and various sheds, all showing clear signs of neglect: peeling paint, a sagging roof on one of the smaller sheds, tall grass growing right up to the foundations. "Well, I'll be damned," Jackson murmured, pulling up in front of the house. It wasn't the run-down disaster he'd expected. Tired and neglected, yes, but there was good bones here. Something worth salvaging, perhaps. He sat in the idling truck for a long moment, suddenly hesitant. This place represented something he'd been avoiding for 2 years. Permanence, a decision, a future to build rather than just days to get through. The keys felt heavy in his pocket as he finally stepped out of the truck. The mountain air was cool and sharp in his lungs, carrying the scent of pine and something else, a musky animal smell that seemed out of place for an abandoned property. Probably just some wild critters that had taken up residence, he figured. He'd need to check for raccoons or squirrels that might have made homes in the attic. The front door creaked on its hinges as the key turned smoothly in the lock. Jackson stepped inside, expecting dust and darkness. Instead, the interior was surprisingly clean, if Spartan. Heavy log furniture dominated the living room, a sofa with faded cushions, 2 armchairs, a coffee table made from a split log with the bark still on the edges. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with a pair of antlers mounted above the mantel. The kitchen beyond was basic but functional, with an old gas stove and a refrigerator that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Not exactly abandoned," he muttered, running a finger along the kitchen counter and finding only a light film of dust. Someone had been here relatively recently. The caretaker, perhaps, checking on the place periodically. Upstairs, he found 3 bedrooms, one clearly his uncle's with clothes still hanging in the closet, a pair of reading glasses on the nightstand next to a well-thumbed Louis L'Amour novel. The other rooms were sparsely furnished, guest rooms that looked like they hadn't been used in years. Back downstairs, Jackson's attention was drawn to a desk in the corner of the living room. Neat stacks of papers were arranged across its surface, and a ledger book lay open, entries in a tight, precise handwriting filling its pages. He flipped through it, recognizing it as some sort of accounting system, though the entries were cryptic, numbers and abbreviated notes that made little sense to him. A photograph in a simple wooden frame caught his eye. He picked it up, wiping a thin layer of dust from the glass. It showed a much younger Elijah standing proudly in front of the barn. Unlike the solitary figure Jackson remembered from his rare childhood encounters, the man in the photo was surrounded by animals: cattle, sheep, several horses, even what looked like a few goats. His uncle's face bore a broad smile, something Jackson couldn't recall ever seeing in person. "So you did have livestock," he murmured to the photo. "What happened to them all?" As if in answer, a distant sound reached his ears, a low, mournful lowing that could only be a cow. Jackson frowned, setting down the photograph and moving to the window. The sound came again, from the direction of the barn. That couldn't be right. According to everything he'd been told, the animals had been sold off after his uncle's death, the ranch sitting empty ever since. He stepped out onto the porch, listening intently. The sound had stopped, but now he noticed other things: tracks in the mud near the barn that looked fresh, patches where the grass was eaten down lower than the surrounding areas. Something wasn't adding up. Moving cautiously toward the barn, Jackson noticed the door was secured with a padlock that looked newer than the surrounding hardware. He tried the keys from his pocket one by one until the 5th one clicked, the lock opening in his hand. "Hello?" he called, suddenly feeling foolish. What was he expecting? Squatters? Rustlers? He pushed the heavy door open and the smell hit him first, the unmistakable scent of livestock. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he froze in disbelief. Stalls lined both sides of the central corridor, and nearly every one contained an animal. Horses nickered softly in some, while others held cattle. He could make out sheep in a pen at the far end, and what looked like a few goats mixed among them. "What the hell?" Jackson whispered, stepping further inside. The animals seemed well fed and healthy, their stalls clean, water troughs filled. Someone had been caring for them, and recently, a noise behind him made him spin around. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright outside light, shorter than Jackson and wiry, with a weather-beaten face under a battered straw hat. "You must be Elijah's nephew," the man said, no surprise in his voice. "Wondered when you'd finally show up." Jackson stared at him, questions tumbling through his mind. "Who are you? And what are all these animals doing here? I was told this place was abandoned." The man stepped forward, extending a calloused hand. "Name's Henry McAllister. I worked for your uncle for 27 years. And as for the ranch being abandoned," he gestured toward the stalls with a slight smile. "Does this look abandoned to you?" Jackson stared at Henry McAllister's outstretched hand for a long moment before finally shaking it. The old ranch hand's grip was firm, his skin tough as leather from decades of outdoor work. "I don't understand," Jackson said, looking around at the animals. "The lawyer told me everything had been sold off after my uncle died, said the place had been sitting empty." Henry snorted. "Lawyers. What do they know about ranching?" He gestured for Jackson to follow him deeper into the barn. "On paper, sure, these animals were sold. Your uncle made arrangements before he passed. Sold the entire herd to me for $1. To you? Why? Because Elijah knew what would happen if the bank or some developer got their hands on this place. Henry stopped at a stall where a magnificent bay gelding stuck its head out, nudging the old man's pocket for treats. This here's Thunder. Your uncle raised him from a foal. That one over there, he pointed to a dapple-gray mare. That's Stormcloud. Every animal here has a name and a story. Jackson ran a hand through his hair, struggling to make sense of it all. So, you've been maintaining this place all by yourself for 2 years? Feeding all these animals, how is that even possible? Is that even? Not all by myself, Henry replied. Got a couple local boys who help out part-time. Paid them from the ranch account your uncle set up before he passed. There should still be money in there. Not much, mind you, but enough to keep things running for another year or so. Jackson leaned against a post, trying to process this information. Why keep it secret? Why not just tell me? Henry's weathered face grew serious. Your uncle wasn't sure you'd want the responsibility. He knew about your wife passing, sorry for your loss, by the way, and thought you might just sell the place if you knew what came with it. He wanted to give you a chance to see it first, to feel the place before making that decision. Feel the place? Jackson repeated, skeptical. That's what he said. Henry shrugged. Elijah believed this land has a way of calling to certain people. Said it called to him when he was about your age. Thought maybe it would call to you too. Jackson wasn't sure how to respond to that. He'd never been one for mystical connections to the land despite spending most of his life working it. To him, earth was earth, grass was grass. You worked it, respected it, but he'd never felt called by it. How many animals are we talking about here? He asked, changing the subject. 62 head of cattle, 38 sheep, 12 horses, 9 goats, a few barn cats, and Rusty. Rusty? As if on cue, an aging Australian shepherd appeared at Henry's side, looking up at Jackson with intelligent eyes. That's Rusty, Henry said with affection. Been here longer than me. Jackson crouched down, offering his hand for the dog to sniff. Rusty gave it a cursory inspection before accepting a gentle scratch behind the ears. What am I supposed to do with all this? Jackson asked, straightening up. The question was directed as much at himself as at Henry. That's for you to decide. Henry led the way out of the barn and into the sunlight. Your uncle left it all to you, free and clear. You can sell it, run it, burn it to the ground if you want to, though I'd appreciate if you'd wait until I got the animals out if you choose that last option. Jackson couldn't help but chuckle at the old man's dry humor. I'm not planning on any arson. Good to hear. Henry gestured toward the main house. There's coffee on if you want some. Figured you'd be showing up any day now, so I've been keeping the pot full. Inside, the kitchen seemed different now that Jackson knew the place wasn't abandoned. What he'd taken for neglect now appeared as the simple, functional space of someone who lived alone and valued practicality over appearance. Henry poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one before Jackson at the kitchen table. So you've been living here too? Jackson asked, taking a grateful sip. The coffee was strong and bitter, just like he preferred. Henry nodded. In the foreman's cabin out back of the main house, been my home for nearly 3 decades now. And what happens now that I'm here? That's up to you. The place is yours. I've just been keeping it running until you showed up. Jackson stared into his coffee mug, watching the dark liquid ripple with his slight movements. He hadn't planned on staying more than a day or two, just long enough to look the place over and make arrangements with a realtor to put it on the market. But now, I don't know the first thing about sheep, he admitted. Or goats, for that matter. They're not so different from cattle once you get to know them. Each has their own personality, their own needs. The way Henry spoke about the animals reminded Jackson of his wife. Annie had treated every creature on their Texas ranch like a member of the family. She'd given names to all the horses, even some of the cattle. After she died, those names had become painful reminders of her absence, one more reason he'd needed to sell and move on. "I need to think about this," Jackson said finally. "It's a lot to take in." "Of course." Henry rose from the table. "I've got afternoon feeding to do. You're welcome to join me, get to know the stock a bit." Jackson hesitated, then nodded. What else was he going to do? Sit alone in the house with his thoughts? He'd been doing that for 2 years, and it hadn't brought him any peace. Outside, the afternoon sun had dropped lower, casting golden light across the property. Following Henry to a storage shed, Jackson helped load hay onto a small tractor-pulled wagon. They drove it first to the pasture where most of the cattle were grazing, then to the sheep enclosure. Watching the old ranch hand work, Jackson was impressed by his efficiency and the obvious care he took with each animal. Every creature seemed to know Henry, responding to his voice with what Jackson could only interpret as affection. "Your uncle used to say that animals are better judges of character than most people," Henry remarked as they finished distributing feed to the goats. "They don't care about your past, only how you treat them in the present." Jackson found himself in the middle of the main corral, surrounded by animals. A young heifer nudged his hand curiously, while 2 sheep pressed against his legs. He stood still, overwhelmed by their innocent trust. For a brief moment, he felt something stir inside him, something he thought had died with Annie. The simple comfort of being needed, of caring for creatures that depended on you. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was a reminder that he was still capable of feeling something beyond grief. "Your uncle left you more than just land and buildings," Henry said quietly, watching Jackson's face. "He left you a purpose if you want it." Jackson didn't answer, but as the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, he found himself considering possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to imagine for a very long time. That night, Jackson couldn't sleep. He lay awake in what had been his uncle's bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the creak of settling timber, the whisper of wind through the pines outside, the occasional distant lowing of cattle. So different from the cheap motel rooms and bunkhouses he'd occupied for the past 2 years. Around 3 in the morning, he gave up trying. Pulling on his jeans and boots, he made his way downstairs and out onto the front porch. The night was clear, the sky ablaze with stars in a way you never saw near cities. The Milky Way stretched across the blackness like spilled sugar. "Can't sleep?" Jackson started at the voice. Henry sat in a rocking chair at the far end of the porch, a thermos cup in his hand. "Didn't see you there," Jackson said, his heart rate slowly returning to normal. "Old habit from my army days. I don't sleep much, especially when the moon's this bright." Jackson nodded toward the cup. "Coffee?" "Nah, herbal tea. Helps the joints." Henry gestured to another chair. "Sit if you want. Night air's good for thinking." Jackson lowered himself into the chair, its worn wood surprisingly comfortable. For several minutes they sat in silence, the only sounds the gentle creak of Henry's rocker and the chirping of crickets. "How well did you know him?" Jackson finally asked. "My uncle." Henry took a sip from his cup, considering. "Better than most, I suppose. Elijah wasn't one to let people get too close. Had his reasons for that." "What reasons?" "Life gave him some hard knocks early on. His wife leaving him, taking their daughter with her. Never saw either of them again. That kind of thing changes a man." Jackson absorbed this. He'd known his uncle was once married, but little beyond that. His own father, Elijah's younger brother, had rarely spoken of it. "He found his peace here, though," Henry continued. "With the land, the animals. They gave him purpose when people let him down." The parallel to Jackson's own situation wasn't lost on him, but he kept in touch with my father, at least sometimes. Family was complicated for Elijah. He kept tabs on you, though. Had newspaper clippings about that rodeo championship you won in your 20s. Knew when you got married, when you bought your place in Texas. Henry paused. He knew about your wife's passing, too. Took it hard, though you wouldn't have known it to look at him. Jackson stared out at the moonlit property, a tightness in his throat. The idea that this virtual stranger had been quietly following his life, feeling connected to him despite the distance, stirred emotions he couldn't quite name. "What happens to the animals if I sell?" he asked, voicing the question that had been troubling him since discovering them. Henry was quiet for a long moment. Most likely they'd be sold off, some to other ranchers, some to slaughter. The horses might find good homes if we're lucky. Rusty would stay with me wherever I end up. Jackson nodded, his stomach turning at the thought. He'd seen enough ranch liquidations to know how it worked. Animals that had been born and raised together, that had formed their own social structures and relationships scattered to the winds. "I'm not saying I'm staying," he clarified quickly. "Just trying to understand what I'm dealing with." "Fair enough," Henry replied, no judgment in his voice. "It's a big decision." When dawn broke, Jackson was still on the porch, though Henry had retreated to his cabin hours before. As the first golden rays touched the mountains, he made up his mind. He would stay for a week, just to get a feel for the place, to understand what running it would entail. That didn't mean committing to anything long-term, just gathering information. After a quick breakfast, he found Henry in the barn, already well into his morning chores. "Need an extra pair of hands?" Jackson offered. Henry looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Always. Start by mucking out the horse stalls while I finish with the feed." The work was familiar, almost comforting in its physicality. Jackson fell into the rhythm of it, his body remembering the motions from years on his own ranch. By mid-morning, they had completed the barn chores and moved on to checking fences along the eastern perimeter. "Your uncle was meticulous about maintenance," Henry explained as they bounced along in an ancient but well-maintained pickup. Said an ounce of prevention was worth more than a pound of cure when it came to livestock. "My father was the same way," Jackson replied, realizing as he said it that it was the first time he'd mentioned his family without that immediate stab of pain. "Used to drive me crazy as a kid, spending weekends fixing things that didn't look broken to me. And now? Now I understand it was the only way to stay ahead of the chaos. Nature's always trying to reclaim what you build." Henry nodded appreciatively, exactly how Elijah saw it. They spent the day making minor repairs, Henry pointing out landmarks and sharing snippets of the ranch's history. Jackson learned that his uncle had bought the place when it was barely more than a rundown cabin and a few acres of overgrazed pasture. He'd built it up over decades, adding land when he could, improving what he had when he couldn't. "That north pasture," Henry said, pointing to a lush field where cattle grazed contentedly, "was nothing but rocks and scrub when he bought it. Took 5 summers of clearing stones by hand before it would grow decent grass." As the sun began to set, they made their way back to the barn for evening feeding. This time, Jackson took a more active role, getting to know the individual animals. There was Bella, a gentle Jersey cow who'd been hand-raised after her mother died. Samson, an enormous Suffolk ram with a surprisingly sweet disposition. And Domino, a black and white paint horse who seemed determined to get into every pocket Jackson had, searching for treats. "He does that to everyone," Henry chuckled as Jackson fended off the horse's persistent muzzle. "Your uncle spoiled him rotten." After dinner, a simple but hearty stew Henry had prepared, Jackson found himself back on the porch, this time with a battered photo album he'd discovered on a bookshelf. It contained the visual history of Whispering Pines Ranch, from its humble beginnings to the present day. Photos of his uncle, younger and less careworn than Jackson remembered him, building fences, delivering calves, standing proudly with prize animals at county fairs. What struck him most were the smiles. In every photo, no matter how difficult the task captured, Elijah looked genuinely happy. It was so at odds with the stern, taciturn man who had visited their Texas home twice during Jackson's childhood, once for his grandfather's funeral, once for his father's. A soft whine drew his attention. Rusty stood at the edge of the porch, looking up at him with soulful eyes. "Come on up, boy." Jackson patted the space beside his chair. The old dog needed no further invitation, settling himself against Jackson's leg with a contented sigh. Something about the animal's trust and the weight of the day's experiences broke through a barrier Jackson had carefully maintained for 2 years. For the first time since Annie's death, he allowed himself to weep openly, his tears falling silently in the gathering darkness, while a dog he barely knew offered the simple comfort of presence. Jackson woke before dawn, feeling more rested than he had in months. The decision to stay for a week had somehow lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. For the first time in 2 years, he had a purpose beyond simply making it to the next day. He found Henry already in the kitchen, scrambling eggs on the ancient stove. "Hope you don't mind," the old man said. "Figured you might be hungry after yesterday." "I could eat," Jackson admitted, pouring himself a cup of the coffee already brewing. "Thought I'd look over the books today, get a better understanding of what's involved in running this place." Henry nodded approvingly. "Good idea. Your uncle kept records on everything. They're in his office. First door on the right of the hallway." After breakfast, Jackson settled at Elijah's desk. The room was small but meticulously organized, with filing cabinets along one wall and a large map of the property hanging on another. He started with the ledgers, tracking income and expenses for the past 5 years. What he found surprised him. The ranch wasn't making much profit, but it was largely self-sustaining. His uncle had diversified in ways Jackson hadn't expected, selling wool from the sheep, crafting and selling handmade furniture from trees harvested on the property, even renting out the far pasture to a neighboring rancher during summer months. By lunchtime, his head was swimming with figures and ideas. He wandered outside to clear his mind and found himself drawn to the barn. Inside, he was surprised to discover 2 unfamiliar faces, a lanky teenage boy and a girl who looked to be in her early 20s, both busily working with the animals. "You must be Mr. Reeves," the girl said, straightening from where she'd been examining a sheep's hoof. "I'm Dr. Samantha Wilkins. Everyone calls me Sam." "Doctor?" Jackson questioned, taking in her youth and casual appearance, jeans, flannel shirt, and a baseball cap with her ponytail pulled through the back. She grinned, clearly used to the reaction. "Graduated veterinary school last year. I come by twice a month to check on the animals. This is my assistant, Tyler." The boy nodded shyly, then returned to his task of refilling water troughs. "Henry mentioned you'd arrived," Sam continued. "He wasn't sure if you'd still be here when I came for my regular visit." "I'm staying a week," Jackson replied, then added, almost defensively, "just to get a feel for the place." Sam nodded, her expression neutral. "Makes sense. It's a big responsibility." "How did you get involved with all this?" Jackson asked, gesturing to the animals. "I mean with my uncle's arrangement. Your uncle was one of my first clients when I moved my practice here. He couldn't afford to pay me much, so we worked out a trade. I'd provide care for his animals at a reduced rate, and he'd supply me with firewood for the winter. After he passed, Henry kept up our arrangement." She paused. "Your uncle was something special, Mr. Reeves. He cared about these animals like they were his family." The words hit Jackson with unexpected force. Annie had been the same way about their animals back in Texas. He'd always been the practical one, seeing livestock as assets, though not without respect or care. She'd been the one who insisted on naming them, who would sit with a sick calf through the night, who believed that the bond between human and animal was sacred. "Please call me Jackson," he said, pushing away the memory. "Mr. Reeves was my father." "Jackson, then." Sam smiled, revealing a small gap between her front teeth that somehow added to her charm. "Want to help me with my rounds? I could use an extra pair of hands." The next 3 hours passed quickly as Jackson assisted Sam with her examination of the animals. She was thorough and knowledgeable, explaining what she was checking for and why. Jackson found himself impressed by her combination of scientific precision and gentle touch. "That mare has arthritis," she explained as they observed an older horse. "Your uncle made a special liniment for her joints. The recipe's probably in his notes somewhere. It worked better than anything I could prescribe." "He sounds like he knew what he was doing," Jackson said. "He was self-taught but brilliant with animals, had an instinct for what they needed." She glanced at Jackson curiously. "Henry says you had a ranch in Texas. For 12 years, cattle operation, some horses." The words came easier than he expected. "Sold it 2 years ago after my wife passed." "I'm sorry," Sam said simply, without the usual awkward platitudes that made such conversations unbearable. "Thanks." When Sam's examination was complete, they found Henry and Tyler preparing lunch on the back porch, thick sandwiches and iced tea. "Everything looking good, Doc?" Henry asked as they settled around the worn picnic table. "Very good," Sam confirmed. "That new heifer's pregnancy is progressing nicely. Should calve in about 2 months." "Pregnancy?" Jackson looked up in surprise. "The herd is breeding?" Henry shrugged. "Circle of life. We sell off some calves each year to pay for feed and such. Keep the best for breeding. Your uncle was particular about his bloodlines." Jackson absorbed this. The operation was more complex and established than he'd realized. Not just maintaining animals, but actively managing a sustainable herd. After lunch, Sam and Tyler departed with promises to return in 2 weeks. Jackson found himself oddly disappointed to see them go, particularly Sam. Something about her straightforward manner and obvious passion for her work reminded him of Annie. "She's a good vet," Henry remarked, catching Jackson's gaze following their truck down the driveway. "Smart as a whip and cares about the animals, not just the paycheck." "Seems that way," Jackson agreed, a little too quickly. Henry's knowing smile suggested he'd caught more than Jackson intended to reveal, but the old man said nothing further. That afternoon, a spring storm rolled in, bringing with it driving rain and occasional thunder. Jackson and Henry worked together to ensure all the animals were sheltered and secure, moving quickly in wordless coordination as if they'd been working together for years instead of days. When the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a steady rainfall, they retreated to the main house. Henry built a fire in the stone fireplace while Jackson prepared coffee. "Your uncle loved days like this," Henry said, settling into an armchair with his mug. "Said the rain washing everything clean gave him time to think." Jackson stood at the window watching raindrops trace patterns down the glass. "I never really knew him," he admitted. "But being here, seeing what he built, I feel like I'm starting to." "He was a complicated man," Henry said. "Private, stubborn as hell, but fair, always fair." "Why did he leave this place to me? We barely spoke twice in 30 years. Henry considered his answer carefully. "He kept track of you, like I said. Read about your ranch in Texas, how you built it up from nothing. I think he saw something of himself in you. And after your wife passed?" He hesitated. "I think he understood that kind of loss better than most." Jackson turned from the window. "Because of his wife leaving?" "Partly that, but there was more to it. Elijah carried guilt about your father, too, his brother." "Guilt? Why?" "They had a falling out when they were young men. Something about your grandfather's inheritance, I don't know the details. They didn't speak for years. By the time Elijah wanted to make amends, your father was already sick. Too late for reconciliation. Jackson had never heard this story. His father had rarely mentioned his older brother, and when he did, there was always an undercurrent of resentment Jackson hadn't understood. I think this place, Henry gestured around them. Leaving it to you was his way of trying to make things right. Outside, the rain continued to fall, gentle now, nurturing the land. Jackson felt something shift within him, not healing exactly, but a softening of the hard shell he'd built around his grief. In this house full of his uncle's presence, surrounded by the legacy of a man who had known loss and regret, but had found purpose nonetheless, Jackson felt the first tentative stirrings of possibility. By the third day at Whispering Pines, Jackson had fallen into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings began before dawn, working alongside Henry to feed and check the animals. Afternoons were spent on maintenance projects, fixing fences, cleaning out irrigation ditches, servicing the ancient tractor that had surely seen better days, but still ran with a determined rumble. Despite his initial plan to simply observe, Jackson found himself fully immersed in the day-to-day operations of the ranch. His hands, which had grown soft during his 2 years of drifting, quickly regained their calluses. His body, though tired at day's end, felt useful again. Your uncle kept a journal, Henry mentioned casually as they repaired a section of barn roof damaged in the recent storm. Might be worth reading if you want to understand his approach to this place. That evening, Jackson found the journal in the bottom drawer of his uncle's desk, a thick leather-bound volume with pages covered in precise handwriting. He settled in the porch rocker with a cup of coffee and began to read. The journal wasn't a daily diary, but rather a record of observations and reflections spanning 2 decades. Elijah wrote about weather patterns, animal behavior, successes and failures with various crops. But woven between these practical entries were deeper musings about purpose, solitude, and connection to the land. The city believes itself immortal with its concrete and steel, one entry read, but it's the land that endures. Here I am reminded daily of my own insignificance and yet, paradoxically, of my responsibility. These animals, this soil, they continue whether I am here or not. My job is to be a good steward in the brief time I'm given. Jackson found himself unexpectedly moved by his uncle's words. The man he'd barely known in life was revealing himself through these pages as thoughtful, philosophical, deeply committed to the life he'd chosen. Another entry, dated shortly after what would have been Annie's death, caught his eye. Heard about Jackson's loss today. That kind of grief can hollow a man out, leave him an empty shell walking through life. I know that darkness. Hope he finds his way back to the light somehow. Jackson closed the journal, throat tight. How had his uncle, a virtual stranger, understood so precisely what he'd been experiencing? The hollowness, the sense of merely going through the motions of living without truly being alive. More importantly, had Elijah found his way back from similar darkness? And if so, how? The next morning, a battered pickup truck with Wilson Construction, stenciled on its door, pulled into the driveway. A burly man with a salt and pepper beard emerged, eyeing Jackson suspiciously. "You the nephew?" he asked without preamble. "Jackson Reeves," he confirmed, extending his hand. The man shook it firmly. "Mike Wilson, I'm here about the roof." "What roof?" "Main house. Your uncle contracted me to replace it before he passed. Half the payment's already made. I'm here to finish the job now that the spring weather's settled." Jackson looked up at the roof, noticing for the first time the weathered, curling shingles. "Henry didn't mention this." "Henry's got enough on his plate with the animals," Mike replied. "Look, if you don't want it done, I can refund Elijah's deposit, but that roof won't make it through another winter." Jackson hesitated only briefly. "No, go ahead. If my uncle thought it was necessary, it probably is." Mike nodded as if this confirmed something for him. I'll get my crew started tomorrow. Should take about a week. After the contractor left, Jackson found Henry in the sheep pen, helping a ewe that had gotten tangled in some loose fencing. Did you know about the roof contract? He asked. Henry looked up, carefully freeing the sheep's leg before answering. Slipped my mind with everything else going on. Your uncle had a whole list of improvements planned before he got sick. The roof was just the most urgent. What other improvements? New irrigation system for the east pasture, solar panels to cut the electricity bills, renovating the old bunkhouse into an office and small store for selling wool products directly. Henry shrugged. Dreams, mostly. Elijah was always planning for the future, even when he knew he might not see it. That afternoon, Jackson drove into town for supplies. Riverdale was small but bustling, with a main street lined with businesses that had clearly been operating for generations. At the feed store, the older man behind the counter studied him intently. You're Elijah Reeves's nephew, he stated rather than asked. News travels fast, Jackson observed. Small town. The man extended his hand. Bill Thornton, your uncle was a good customer and a better friend. As Bill filled his order, other customers drifted in, each finding reasons to introduce themselves. By the time Jackson left with his supplies, he'd met what felt like half the town. Ranchers who'd borrowed equipment from his uncle, a teacher whose class had visited the ranch for educational trips, an elderly woman who swore by the honey Elijah had produced from his small apiary. Your uncle was well respected around here, Bill said as he helped load the supplies. People have been wondering what would happen to Whispering Pines. I'm just staying a week, Jackson responded automatically. Getting things in order. Bill gave him a look that suggested he'd heard this before. Well, whatever you decide, you've got friends here. Elijah made sure of that. Driving back to the ranch, Jackson's mind was full. Every person he'd met had a story about Elijah, how he'd helped during hard times, shared knowledge, contributed to the community. The solitary man Jackson had briefly known appeared to have been deeply connected to this place and its people, despite his reputation for privacy. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the sight of Sam's truck parked outside the barn. Something inside him lifted at the prospect of seeing her again. He found her examining one of the cows, her expression concerned as she pressed a stethoscope against the animal's side. "Problem?" he asked, approaching. She glanced up, a brief smile crossing her face before returning to professional focus. "Listening for bloat. Henry called me because Daisy here wasn't eating." Jackson waited silently as she completed her examination, impressed by her thoroughness and the gentle way she handled the nervous animal. "She'll be okay," Sam finally declared. "Early stage bloat. I've given her something to help, but she'll need careful monitoring tonight." "I can take the first shift," Jackson offered. Henry was up late with the new lambs last night. Sam studied him, seeming to evaluate whether he was capable. "You've dealt with bloat before?" "More times than I can count. Had a 100-head operation in Texas." She nodded, satisfied. "Good. Watch for increased discomfort, difficulty breathing. Call me if anything changes." She handed him a small bottle of medication. 2 cc's every 4 hours. As they walked out of the barn together, Sam hesitated. "I'm sorry I didn't call ahead. It was an emergency call." "No need to apologize. I'm glad you came." The words came out more earnestly than he'd intended. An awkward silence fell between them, broken when Sam gestured to his truck. "Feed store run?" "Yeah. Apparently my uncle had quite a following in town." Sam smiled. "That's putting it mildly. Elijah was an institution around here, though he'd have hated hearing it put that way. He judged people by how they treated animals and the land, not by their words. Made him a good judge of character." What would he have thought of me? Jackson asked, surprising himself with the question. Sam considered him thoughtfully. I think he'd be pleased to see you here, taking care of his animals. She glanced at her watch. I should get going. Other patients to see. As she climbed into her truck, she turned back. There's a community dinner at the Grange Hall Saturday night. Most of the ranchers and farmers show up. Might be a good way for you to meet more people. She hesitated, then added, I could save you a seat if you want. Jackson found himself nodding. I'd like that. After she drove away, he stood motionless, a strange feeling spreading through his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as something close to anticipation, to looking forward rather than backward. For the first time in 2 years, he was thinking about the future, even if that future extended only as far as a community dinner 3 days away. That night, Jackson settled into a chair beside Daisy's stall, prepared for his watch. The cow seemed more comfortable after Sam's treatment, but he knew from experience how quickly bloat could turn dangerous. He'd brought his uncle's journal with him, finding unexpected comfort in the words of a man he was posthumously coming to know. Around midnight, Henry appeared with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich. Thought you might need this, he said, handing them over. How's our girl doing? Better, I think, Jackson replied, accepting the food gratefully. Breathing's easier and she's not as distressed. Henry nodded, crouching to examine the cow himself. Sam knows her stuff. She does, Jackson agreed, perhaps too quickly. At Henry's knowing look, he changed the subject. Tell me something, did my uncle ever consider selling this place? In his later years, I mean. Henry settled on an upturned bucket nearby. Had offers, especially after he got sick. Developer wanted to turn it into vacation cabins. Another rancher offered good money for the grazing land. Elijah wouldn't hear of it. Why not? Would have made his life easier. Wasn't about easy with your uncle. Henry gestured toward the animals sleeping in their stalls. These creatures depended on him. This land depended on him. Selling would have meant breaking a promise the way he saw it. A promise to whom? To himself, I guess. Maybe to whatever higher power he believed in. Henry shrugged. Elijah had his own code. Part of it was seeing things through, no matter how hard they got. Jackson thought about this as he gave Daisy her medication. His own decision to sell the Texas ranch had been immediate and unquestioned. The place had become unbearable without Annie. Every corner held memories that cut like knives. But looking back now, he wondered if running had been the right choice. What would Annie have wanted? The question haunted him through his vigil, even after Henry retired to his cabin. By dawn, Daisy was showing clear signs of improvement, and Jackson's thoughts had drifted from his patient to the broader question of his future. The week he'd planned to stay was nearly half over. Soon, he would need to make a decision: sell Whispering Pines and continue his rootless existence, or stay and take up the mantle his uncle had left him. Neither option felt quite right, yet the thought of leaving stirred an unexpected discomfort. After breakfast, Mike Wilson and his 3-man crew arrived to begin work on the roof. The construction noise provided a soundtrack to the day as Jackson helped Henry with the regular chores, then turned his attention to the broken irrigation pump that served the vegetable garden. Your uncle grew most of his own food, Henry explained as they examined the rusted mechanism. Said store-bought vegetables had no soul. Jackson couldn't help but smile. Annie used to say the same thing. She had a vegetable patch that could feed an army. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife without that immediate stab of pain. The memory felt almost warm, something to be treasured rather than avoided. By mid-afternoon, they had the pump working again, water flowing to the neglected garden beds that would soon be ready for planting. Jackson stood watching the water seep into the soil, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. Uncle Elijah mentioned an apiary in his journal, he said. Where is it? Henry pointed toward a cluster of pine trees on the eastern edge of the property. Up by the creek. 15 hives last count. Haven't been properly tended since he got sick, though we keep an eye on them. I'd like to see them. The path to the apiary wound through a stand of aspen trees, their leaves chattering in the breeze. As they emerged into a small clearing, Jackson saw the white wooden boxes arranged in a semicircle, facing south to catch the morning sun. A small shed stood nearby, presumably housing equipment. "Your uncle was proud of these," Henry said, keeping a respectful distance from the busy hives. Said working with bees taught him patience like nothing else could. Jackson approached carefully, watching the industrious insects come and go. The steady hum of their activity was oddly soothing. "I don't know the first thing about beekeeping," he admitted. "Marion Caldwell does," Henry replied. "She's the local expert. Helped your uncle set these up years ago, still stops by occasionally to check on them." "Another person in my uncle's network," Jackson observed. "Seems like he had connections throughout the community, despite being supposedly solitary." Elijah understood something important. You can be private without being isolated. Henry gave Jackson a meaningful look. There's a difference between solitude and loneliness. That evening, after checking on Daisy one last time, Jackson drove back into town. He told himself he was just going for supplies they'd forgotten earlier, but his true destination was the small veterinary practice on the edge of town. The lights were still on, Sam's truck parked outside. He hesitated before entering, suddenly unsure why he was there. To update her on Daisy's condition. That could have been done with a phone call. To thank her for her help. Also unnecessary. To see her again. That admission stirred feelings he wasn't ready to examine. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. Sam looked up from her desk, surprise and something else flickering across her face. "Jackson, is everything okay? Is it Daisy?" "She's fine," he assured her quickly, responding well to the medication. He faltered, then settled on, "I wanted to thank you in person." Sam studied him for a moment, then nodded toward a coffee pot in the corner. "I was just about to close up. Want a cup?" They sat in her small office, mugs in hand, as she told him about her day. A horse with colic, a litter of unexpected puppies, a goat that had eaten something it shouldn't. Jackson found himself relaxing, enjoying the simple exchange of stories and the animated way she described her patients. "I wanted to be a vet since I was 8, she said when he asked about her career choice. "My parents thought I'd grow out of it, especially when they realized it meant decades of student loans. But some dreams don't let go." Annie was like that about teaching, Jackson found himself saying. Knew from childhood it was her calling. Taught second grade for 15 years, loved every minute of it. Sam's expression softened. "She sounds like she was special." She was. The words came easier now. She would have loved this place, the animals, the community, all of it. "And you?" Sam asked gently. "What do you love, Jackson Reeves?" The question caught him off guard. What did he love now? For 2 years, he'd existed in a state of emotional numbness, feeling little beyond grief and regret. But here, at Whispering Pines, something was changing. He was changing. "I'm not sure anymore," he answered honestly, "but I'm starting to remember what it feels like to care about something." Their conversation continued until Sam realized with a start that it was nearly 9 o'clock. "I should lock up," she said reluctantly. "Early rounds tomorrow." In the parking lot, illuminated only by the veterinary clinic sign and the Montana stars, they stood awkwardly, neither quite ready to end the evening. "About Saturday," Sam said finally. "The community dinner. It starts at 6. I could pick you up if you want. Save you having to find the place." "I'd like that," Jackson replied, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Driving back to the ranch, he felt lighter somehow, as if some of the weight he'd been carrying had begun to lift. The night air coming through the open window carried the scent of pine and possibility. At the ranch, he found Henry on the porch, smoking his evening pipe. "Daisy's doing well," Jackson reported. "I checked her before heading into town." Henry nodded, not asking where Jackson had been or why. Instead, he said, "Roof crew made good progress today. Mike thinks they'll be done ahead of schedule." "Good to hear." Jackson sat in the adjacent rocker, the events of the day settling around him like a comfortable blanket. "I've been thinking, Henry, maybe I should stay another week. There's still a lot to learn about this place." The old man tamped his pipe thoughtfully. "Ranch has a way of growing on you." "It does," Jackson admitted, looking out at the shadowy outlines of the barn and corrals where 100 animals, his animals now, rested under the Montana stars. "It really does." Saturday arrived with a clear sky and a sense of anticipation that Jackson couldn't quite shake. The week had passed in a blur of activity, checking fences, learning the intricacies of sheep care, watching the roof replacement progress, and spending long evenings reading his uncle's journals. He'd found himself increasingly absorbed in the rhythm of ranch life, the daily patterns forming a structure that felt both new and somehow familiar. "You need a haircut," Henry observed over breakfast. "Can't go to the community dinner looking like you just rolled out of a haystack." Jackson ran a hand through his shaggy hair, realizing the old man was right. In his 2 years of drifting, personal grooming had fallen low on his priority list. "There a barber in town?" "Cal Jenkins runs a shop next to the hardware store. Nothing fancy, but he won't send you out looking worse than when you went in." 2 hours later, Jackson studied his reflection in Cal Jenkins' mirror with surprise. The man looking back at him was almost a stranger, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed, eyes clearer than they'd been in longer than he could remember. "Not bad," Cal said, brushing stray hairs from Jackson's shoulders. "You clean up decent, Reeves." "Thanks," Jackson replied, still adjusting to the transformation. It wasn't just the haircut, there was something different in his expression, a vitality that had been missing for too long. As he paid for the haircut, Cal mentioned casually, "Heard you might be sticking around Whispering Pines." News really did travel fast in this town. "Just extended my stay a bit," Jackson clarified, still figuring things out. Cal nodded, not pressing further. "Well, folks would be glad to see that place running properly again. Your uncle was good people." Back at the ranch, Jackson found Henry in the barn with Tyler, the veterinarian's young assistant. They were constructing what appeared to be a portable pen. "One of the ewes is close to lambing," Henry explained. "Sam thinks it might be twins. Figured we should prepare a quiet spot for her." Jackson nodded, remembering similar preparations he'd made countless times in Texas. "Need any help?" "We're about done here," Henry replied, then looked up and did a double take at Jackson's appearance. "Well, look at you. Clean up nice when you try." Tyler, normally shy, grinned at the exchange. "Dr. Sam will be impressed," he ventured, then immediately reddened as both men looked at him. "That so?" Henry asked, amusement evident in his voice. "Anything I should know about our vet's interest in the new ranch owner?" "I just meant," Tyler stammered. "She said it was nice having someone around who knows about large animals. Most people here only have small herds." "Uh-huh," Henry responded skeptically. "Well, I'm sure that's all she meant." Jackson felt his own face growing warm, ridiculous for a man his age. "I'm going to check the south pasture fence," he said, making a hasty retreat. The physical work of mending fences helped settle his thoughts. He wasn't ready for whatever seemed to be developing between him and Sam. Annie had been gone for 2 years, but the wound still felt raw some days. The idea of caring for someone new seemed almost like betrayal, and yet he couldn't deny the way his pulse quickened when he thought about seeing Sam that evening. the anticipation that had nothing to do with fence posts or cattle feed. As he hammered the last staple into a fence post, a truck he didn't recognize pulled up nearby. A middle-aged woman stepped out carrying what looked like a covered basket. "You must be Jackson," she called, approaching with a warm smile. "I'm Marion Caldwell. Henry mentioned you were asking about the bees." The beekeeper, Jackson realized, returning her smile. "Yes, I was hoping to learn more about them." "Well, I brought you some incentive." She handed him the basket. "Honey from your uncle's hives. Best in the county, if I do say so myself." Inside the basket, Jackson found several jars of amber honey and what appeared to be honeycomb wrapped in wax paper. "This is incredibly generous," he said, genuinely touched. "Not at all. Those are your bees now." She gestured toward the distant apiary. "I've been keeping an eye on them, but they really need proper attention. I could teach you if you're planning to stay." There it was again, that assumption that he might remain at Whispering Pines. It was becoming a common refrain among the locals. "I'm still deciding," he admitted, "but I'd appreciate learning, regardless." Marion's expression was understanding. "No rush. Bees have been doing their work for millions of years. They can wait on human decisions." They walked together to the apiary, where Marion gave him a basic introduction to beekeeping, explaining the structure of the hives, the roles of different bees, and the careful balance that made the whole system work. "It's like a tiny civilization," Jackson observed, fascinated despite himself. "Exactly. Your uncle used to say working with bees reminded him that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves." Marion smiled at the memory. "He donated honey to the school lunch program every year, you know. Said every child deserved something sweet." Another piece of his uncle's legacy, another connection to the community that Jackson hadn't known about. The picture of Elijah Reeves was becoming fuller, more complex with each passing day. When Marion left, promising to return for a proper beekeeping lesson, Jackson found himself standing among the humming hives, feeling strangely at peace. The steady, purposeful activity of the bees was hypnotic, a reminder of how life persisted, adapted, continued. By late afternoon, he was showered and dressed in his cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt that had traveled in his duffel bag since Texas. Henry eyed him approvingly when he emerged onto the porch. "Sam just called," the old man said. "She'll be here in 20 minutes. "I feel like I'm 16 again," Jackson admitted, pacing nervously. "It's not a date, for God's sake." "Course not," Henry agreed, far too quickly. "Just two adults going to a community dinner together. Nothing date-like about that at all." Jackson shot him a look, but was saved from responding by the arrival of Mike Wilson coming to report on the roof progress. "We'll be done by Tuesday," the contractor said. "Weather's been in our favor." "Appreciate the quick work," Jackson replied, then hesitated. "My uncle had other projects planned. An irrigation system, solar panel?" Mike nodded. "He talked to me about both. I've got the plans drawn up still, if you're interested." "I might be," Jackson said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Let me see them next week." As Mike drove away, Sam's truck appeared on the horizon. Jackson felt a flutter of nervousness that was both unsettling and strangely invigorating. "Well, would you look at that?" Henry murmured. "Doc's dressed up too." Indeed, as Sam pulled up, Jackson could see she'd traded her usual work clothes for a simple sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of captured in its usual practical ponytail. "Don't wait up," Jackson told Henry as he headed down the porch steps. "Wouldn't dream of it," the old man called after him. "You kids have fun now." Sam's smile when she saw him made the nervous anticipation worth it. "You look nice," she said as he climbed into her truck. "So do you," he replied, meaning it. In the glow of the setting sun, she looked beautiful in a way that made his chest ache with both guilt and hope. The drive to town passed with easy conversation about the day's events, the lambing preparations, Marion's visit, the progress on the roof. Jackson found himself talking more than he had in months, possibly years. "You seem different," Sam observed as they neared town. "More settled somehow." Jackson considered this. "I feel different," he admitted. "This place, it's doing something to me." "That's Whispering Pines for you," she said softly. "It has a way of healing what's broken." As they pulled into the crowded parking lot outside the Grange Hall, Jackson wondered if she was right. If perhaps his uncle had known exactly what he was doing when he left this unexpected inheritance, this chance at a new beginning. The Grange Hall buzzed with activity, tables laden with potluck dishes, children darting between groups of chatting adults, the warm hum of community in full swing. As Jackson followed Sam through the door, he was struck by how many familiar faces he spotted despite his short time in the area. Bill from the feed store waved from across the room. Marion Caldwell beckoned them toward a table where she sat with several other people. "Jackson," she called, "come meet everyone." Before he knew it, he was seated at a table surrounded by locals eager to share their stories about his uncle. Jim Peterson, who owned the neighboring ranch to the west, described how Elijah had helped him through a harsh winter when half his cattle were sick. Eleanor Jenkins, Cal's wife and the town librarian, recalled how Elijah had quietly funded the children's reading program for years. "He'd never admit it was him," she confided. "Always said the money came from an anonymous donor who believes in books, but we all knew." As plates were filled and conversation flowed, Jackson found himself drawn into the fabric of this community more than he'd expected. People asked about his plans for Whispering Pines with genuine interest, not just idle curiosity. When he mentioned Marion's offer to teach him beekeeping, 3 other locals immediately volunteered additional knowledge: gardening tips for plants that attracted bees, carpentry skills for building new hives, connections to regional farmers markets where honey sold well. "You've got quite the support network forming," Sam observed quietly as they stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The spring evening was cool but pleasant, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "It's a little overwhelming," Jackson admitted. "Everyone seems to expect me to stay." "And what do you expect?" she asked, leaning against the porch railing. Jackson looked out at the small town, lights glowing warmly in shop windows, familiar trucks parked along the main street. In just a week, the place had become recognizable, almost comfortable. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "For 2 years, I've been running from everything that reminds me of what I lost. The idea of stopping, of putting down roots again." He shook his head. "It's terrifying." Sam was quiet for a moment. "My father was a military man," she said finally. "We moved every 2 years like clockwork. Never stayed anywhere long enough to feel truly connected. When I finally settled here for my practice, I was surprised by how frightening it felt to know I wasn't leaving in 24 months. What changed? Time, routine, waking up each day and choosing to be here." She turned to face him. "The fear doesn't disappear, Jackson. You just build something stronger alongside it." Inside, someone started playing a fiddle, soon joined by a guitar and banjo. The music spilled out through the open doors, lively and inviting. "They're starting the dancing," Sam said, a question in her eyes. Jackson hesitated. He hadn't danced since Annie. The thought sent a familiar pang through his chest, but it wasn't as sharp as it once would have been. "I'm pretty rusty," he warned. "Luckily, I have excellent balance," she replied with a smile, extending her hand. The dance was simple, couples moving in circles while switching partners periodically. Jackson found himself passed from Eleanor Jenkins to Marion Caldwell, to a teenage girl who informed him very seriously that she would be taking over her parents' ranch someday. Each exchange came with smiles, introductions, brief snippets of conversation that built upon the connections he'd been forming. When he eventually returned to Sam's arms, the warmth in her eyes made his breath catch. For a moment, guilt flared, the sharp reminder that he'd once looked at Annie that way, once held her close as music played around them. But alongside the guilt came something new: permission. The gentle understanding that moving forward didn't mean abandoning the past. "You okay?" Sam asked, noticing the shift in his expression. "Getting there," he replied, and meant it. Later, as they drove back to Whispering Pines under a canopy of stars, a comfortable silence settled between them. Jackson found himself thinking about his uncle's journals, about the man who had found purpose and connection in this remote corner of Montana after his own losses. "Thank you for tonight," he said as Sam pulled up to the ranch house. "I needed that more than I realized." "Community has healing powers all its own," she replied. "Your uncle understood that." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to voice. Sam broke it with a gentle smile. "I should get going. Early rounds tomorrow." "Of course." Jackson opened his door, then hesitated. "Sam, I'd like to take you to dinner sometime, just the two of us." In the dim light of the truck's interior, he saw her expression soften. "I'd like that too." The house was dark when Jackson entered, though a lamp burned low in the living room. On the coffee table, he found a note from Henry. "You started labor. At the barn if needed." Despite the late hour, Jackson made his way to the barn. Inside, he found Henry sitting on a straw bale beside the makeshift lambing pen they'd prepared earlier. The ewe lay on her side, breathing heavily, while two tiny lambs nestled against her. "Twins, as expected," Henry said quietly as Jackson approached. "Born about an hour ago. Mother's doing fine." Jackson crouched beside the pen, watching as the newborns instinctively sought their first meal. The miracle of birth was something he'd witnessed hundreds of times on his Texas ranch, but it never lost its power to move him. "Life goes on," he murmured, almost to himself. "That it does," Henry agreed, his weathered face serene in the soft barn light. "Your uncle used to sit up all night for lambings, said there was nothing that restored faith like watching new life come into the world." Jackson thought about the community he'd experienced tonight, about the welcome he'd received, about Sam's hand in his as they danced, about these tiny creatures taking their first breaths in a world both harsh and beautiful. "I'm thinking of staying," he said, the words surprising him as they left his mouth. Henry nodded, unsurprised. "I figured you might." "Not decided for certain," Jackson clarified, "but I'm leaning that way." "Ranch needs you," Henry said simply. "These animals need you." "And I need them," Jackson realized with sudden clarity. "Need this purpose, this connection to the land and the creatures that depended on him. Need the rhythm of days shaped by meaningful work, the satisfaction of seeing things grow and thrive under his care." As if understanding the importance of the moment, Rusty appeared from the shadows, pressing against Jackson's leg with quiet devotion. Jackson scratched behind the old dog's ears, a lump forming in his throat. "I think Annie would have loved this place," he said softly. "I think she would have too," Henry replied, "and I think she'd be glad to see you finding your way back to life." Outside the barn, the Montana night wrapped around Whispering Pines Ranch like a protective blanket. 100 animals, no longer secret, no longer abandoned, slept peacefully under the stars. And for the first time in 2 years, Jackson Reeves contemplated a future he might actually want to live. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that seemed to vibrate with possibility. Jackson woke early, his decision from the night before still resonating within him. He wasn't completely certain yet. There were practical matters to consider, details to work out, but the direction felt right, in a way nothing had for 2 years. After breakfast, he called the attorney who had handled his uncle's estate. "I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with here," he explained. "Taxes, expenses, legal obligations. If I'm going to make this work, I need to understand the complete picture." The attorney promised to email comprehensive documentation by the end of the day. Next, Jackson called Mike Wilson about the solar panel and irrigation plans. They arranged for Mike to bring the designs over that afternoon. "Making plans?" Henry asked as Jackson hung up the phone, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes betrayed his hope. "Just gathering information," Jackson replied, unwilling to fully commit aloud yet. "But yes, I'm considering it seriously." Henry nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good. Those sheep won't shear themselves." As if to emphasize his point, he handed Jackson a pair of ancient-looking shears. "Might as well start learning. We're already behind schedule." The morning passed in a blur of activity as Henry taught him the basics of sheep shearing: how to position the animal, how to move the shears in long, steady strokes, how to keep the fleece intact for maximum value. It was exhausting work, and by noon Jackson's back ached and his hands were cramped, but there was profound satisfaction in the growing pile of wool. "Your uncle used to hire help for this," Henry mentioned as they took a water break. "But with the uncertainty about the ranch's future, I didn't want to commit anyone's time." "We'll need help if we're going to do this right," Jackson acknowledged, the "we" slipping out naturally. "I saw several high school kids at the dinner last night who might want summer work." "Tyler would be a good start," Henry suggested. "Boy knows animals, works hard, his family could use the extra income too." Jackson nodded, making a mental note. Building a proper operation would require more hands, more knowledge than just his and Henry's. After lunch, Mike Wilson arrived with rolled-up blueprints and a laptop. The 3 men spread the plans across the kitchen table, discussing options, costs, and timelines. "Solar setup would pay for itself in about 5 years," Mike explained, pointing to his calculations. "After that, your electricity costs would be minimal. Your uncle was planning to start with the house and barn, then expand as finances allowed. The irrigation system was more complex but equally thoughtful, designed to maximize water efficiency while minimizing labor." Jackson found himself impressed by his uncle's foresight. "These aren't just repairs," he observed. He was building for the long term. "That was Elijah," Mike agreed, always thinking 20 years ahead. As they discussed implementation details, Jackson's phone rang. Sam calling to check on the newborn lambs. The conversation was brief but warm, ending with confirmation of their dinner plans for the following evening. "Doc Sam, huh?" Mike commented with a knowing grin after Jackson hung up. "She's a good one. Half the ranchers in the county are sweet on her, but she doesn't give most the time of day." "Is that right?" Jackson replied, aiming for casual but feeling a flush creep up his neck. "Sure is. You must have something special." Mike winked at Henry, who was making a poor attempt to hide his amusement. After Mike left with a deposit for the solar installation, Jackson retreated to his uncle's office. The space had become a refuge of sorts, a place to think and plan. He pulled out a legal pad and began making lists: immediate needs, long-term projects, financial considerations. Halfway through his calculations, he heard a vehicle approaching. Looking out the window, he was surprised to see Tyler's mother's car pulling up, the boy himself jumping out before it had fully stopped. Jackson met him at the door. "Everything okay, Tyler?" The teenager was breathless with excitement. "Dr. Sam sent me. One of the pregnant goats is showing signs of labor, but something might be wrong. She's on her way, but said to tell you and Henry to get ready." All thoughts of business plans were immediately forgotten as Jackson followed Tyler to the barn. Henry was already there, preparing a clean stall with fresh bedding. "Nanny's in distress," Henry reported grimly. Breathing's labored, and she's not progressing as she should. Jackson examined the goat, recognizing the signs of a difficult birth. He'd assisted with countless deliveries in Texas, though goats weren't his specialty. Still, the basics were similar across most livestock. "We need warm water, clean towels, and the birthing kit," he instructed Tyler, falling naturally into the role of authority. "And more light. Bring the portable work lamps from the workshop." By the time Sam arrived 15 minutes later, they had everything prepared. She entered the stall, quickly assessed the situation, and looked at Jackson with relief. "Good setup," she acknowledged, washing her hands in the basin they'd prepared. "I think we've got a breech presentation. I'll need an extra pair of hands." "Tell me what to do," Jackson said, moving beside her. What followed was an intense 30 minutes of careful intervention. Sam's expertise combined with Jackson's steady hands as they worked together to reposition the kid and help Nanny deliver safely. When the tiny goat finally emerged, Jackson caught it in a clean towel, clearing its airways, while Sam ensured the mother was stable. "Well done, both of you," Henry said as a second kid, this one presenting normally, arrived with much less drama. Sam smiled up at Jackson, her face flushed with exertion and success. "We make a good team." "We do," he agreed, something warm unfurling in his chest as they cleaned up the newborns. Later, as they watched the mother goat nuzzling her babies, Sam asked quietly, "Have you decided about staying?" Jackson looked around the barn, at Henry showing Tyler how to record the births in the livestock ledger, at Rusty dozing contentedly in the corner, at the twins taking their first wobbly steps. "Pretty much," he admitted. "Still some details to work out, but yes, I think this is where I'm meant to be." The smile that broke across her face was worth any uncertainty he still felt. That evening, after everyone had gone, Jackson sat on the porch with his uncle's journal open on his lap. He'd found an entry from just a month before Elijah's death. "Feeling weaker today. Know my time is growing short. Spoke with the lawyer about Jackson inheriting Whispering Pines. Hope it's the right decision. This land saved me when I thought nothing could. Perhaps it might do the same for him someday." Jackson traced his fingers over the words, a lump forming in his throat. "You were right," he whispered to the memory of an uncle he'd barely known but was coming to understand. "This land does heal." His phone buzzed with a text from Sam. "Just checking. Twins doing well?" "Perfect," he replied, then added, "Looking forward to tomorrow." As he prepared for bed that night, Jackson realized something significant. For the first time in 2 years, he was looking ahead rather than behind, making plans, considering futures, allowing himself to feel anticipation rather than just enduring each day. He pulled open the dresser drawer where he'd placed the few photographs he still carried of Annie. Her smile, frozen in time, still brought an ache to his heart, but it was a gentler pain now, tinged with gratitude for what they'd shared, rather than only grief for what he'd lost. "I think you'd approve," he told her image softly, "of this place, these animals, of me trying to build something again." The Montana wind whispered around the house, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. Outside, 100 animals. His responsibility now, his purpose, settled for the night under star-filled skies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new beginnings. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jackson Reeves found himself ready to meet them. 3 months later, Jackson stood in the center of the main corral, surrounded by animals gathered for their morning feeding. A heifer nudged his hand impatiently while sheep pressed against his legs, their wool already growing back after the spring shearing. Nearby, the twin goat kids that had nearly died during birth pranced playfully around their mother. "Patience," he told them with a laugh, distributing feed in the familiar routine that had become the backbone of his days at Whispering Pines. From the fence, Henry watched with evident satisfaction. "You're a natural," the old man called. "They trust you completely. Jackson nodded, understanding now what his uncle's journal had meant about the sacred responsibility of stewardship. These creatures, 64 cattle now after recent births, 41 sheep, 13 horses, 11 goats, 6 barn cats, and of course Rusty, depended on him. Their welfare had become the purpose that anchored his days, giving structure to a life that had once seemed unbearably empty. The official paperwork making his residency permanent had been filed the previous week. His truck from Texas, along with the few possessions he'd kept in storage, had arrived yesterday. Whispering Pines was truly his home now. "Tyler's here with the new fencing," Henry noted as a pickup truck rattled up the driveway. Jackson smiled, watching the teenager expertly maneuver the vehicle. Tyler had proven to be an excellent hire, his quiet competence with the animals matched by his eagerness to learn. 2 other local kids had joined the team part-time, helping with the increased workload as Jackson implemented his uncle's expansion plans. The solar panels now gleamed on the roof of the main house and barn, already generating enough electricity to notice the difference in monthly bills. The irrigation system was halfway installed, with completion expected before winter. The beehives had been expanded under Marion's expert guidance, and the honey harvest promised to be exceptional. "Morning, boss," Tyler greeted as he climbed down from the truck. The title still felt strange to Jackson, but he was growing into it. "Morning. Let's get that fencing unloaded before the heat picks up." The work was satisfying in its simplicity, physical, demanding, but with tangible results. By midday, they had reinforced the entire eastern section of the sheep enclosure, the new fencing promising years of reliable service. "I'm heading into town for supplies," Jackson told Henry as they cleaned up. "Need anything?" "Nothing that can't wait until Sam brings you back," the old man replied with a knowing smile. Jackson felt the familiar warmth spread across his face. His relationship with Sam had developed slowly but steadily over the past months. Weekly dinners, long conversations on the porch, shared work with the animals they both cared for deeply. They were taking things at a measured pace, both understanding the value of patience when building something meant to last. In town, Jackson moved through his errands with an ease that still occasionally surprised him. The feed store, the hardware shop, the grocery, in each place he was greeted by name, asked about specific animals, engaged in the small talk that formed the fabric of community. He was no longer the stranger who had inherited Elijah's ranch, but Jackson Reeves, rancher, neighbor, community member. His final stop was Sam's veterinary clinic, where he found her finishing paperwork after a busy morning of appointments. "Almost ready?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe of her office. She looked up with a smile that still made his heart skip. "Give me 5 minutes to finish this invoice." While he waited, Jackson chatted with her receptionist about the upcoming county fair. Whispering Pines would have entries in several categories: wool products from the sheep, honey from the hives, and Domino, the paint horse with the treat-seeking nose, in the pleasure riding competition. "You've certainly embraced ranch life," Sam observed as they walked to her truck. "3 months ago, you were still telling everyone you were just staying temporarily." Jackson laughed. "I wasn't fooling anyone, was I?" "Not even yourself, I think." Their destination was a small ridge overlooking Whispering Pines, a favorite spot they'd discovered on one of their early walks together. Sam spread a blanket while Jackson unpacked the simple picnic they'd planned. From this vantage point, the ranch spread below them in a patchwork of fields, buildings, and grazing areas. The afternoon sun cast everything in a golden light that made the scene look almost like a painting. Idyllic, peaceful, vibrant with life. "I got the lab results back on those soil samples," Sam said as they ate. "Your uncle's organic practices paid off. That soil is some of the healthiest in the county." "Not surprised," Jackson replied. "Everything he did was with the long view in mind, including leaving the ranch to you." Jackson nodded, the truth of this statement settling deep within him. I think he knew what it would do for me, what I needed even when I didn't. Sam's hand found his, their fingers intertwining comfortably. He'd be proud of what you're doing with the place. Below them, animals moved across the pastures, dark shapes of cattle against green grass, the lighter forms of sheep clustered near the creek, horses grazing in the distance. 100 creatures that had once been in danger of being separated, sold off, their community disbanded, now secure in their home under his care. I've been thinking, Jackson said slowly, about adding an educational component to the ranch. School visits, maybe workshops for people interested in sustainable practices. My uncle did some of that informally, but I think we could make it more structured. That's a wonderful idea, Sam agreed enthusiastically. The county extension office would probably partner with you, and I know several teachers who'd jump at the chance to bring students out. They discussed possibilities as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, their conversation flowing easily between practical ranch matters and personal hopes for the future. There was a comfortable rhythm to their relationship now, a sense of building something meaningful together, step by careful step. As they packed up the picnic, Jackson paused, looking out over whispering pines. "I never thanked you properly," he said. "For what?" "Being part of all this, helping me see what was possible here." Sam smiled, her eyes reflecting the setting sun. "You were always going to find your way, Jackson. These animals needed you as much as you needed them." Later, back at the ranch, they found Henry on the porch with Rusty, both watching the evening activity in the nearby corrals. "Just in time," the old man said. "Mail came. Thought you might want to see this one yourself." He handed Jackson an official-looking envelope. Inside was confirmation that Whispering Pines Ranch had been officially registered as a conservation enterprise, qualifying for tax benefits and grant opportunities based on their sustainable practices and wildlife habitat preservation. "Another of your uncle's dreams realized," Henry observed. Jackson nodded, deeply satisfied. "One of many." As twilight settled over the ranch, bringing with it the peaceful sounds of animals settling for the night, Jackson reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. 3 months ago, he had arrived expecting to find an abandoned property, a simple matter of inheritance to be quickly resolved and left behind. Instead, he had discovered a secret world of 100 animals waiting for him, creatures that needed care, land that needed stewardship, a community that welcomed his contribution. And in caring for them, he had found healing for his own wounded spirit. Sam's hand slipped into his as they watched the last light fade from the western sky. Behind them, the ranch house glowed with warmth, no longer his uncle's home, but truly his own. Before them stretched fields where animals that might have been lost now thrived under his protection. "Welcome home," Sam whispered, as if reading his thoughts. Jackson Reeves, once widowed and adrift, now rancher and caretaker of Whispering Pines, squeezed her hand in silent agreement. The 100 animals that had once lived in secret had saved him as surely as he had saved them, bringing him back to life when he thought that part of his journey was over. Around them, the Montana night deepened, stars appearing one by one above the ranch that had become, against all expectations, exactly where he was meant to be.